So I spent much of the last lecture talking about conflict within states, how in the aftermath of the French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars, the powers that had gathered together at the Congress of Vienna had tried to set the board of Ancien Regime Europe back up as close as possible to the way it was before. Particularly Metternich were convinced that revolution bred war and war bred revolution, and as such, war between states was to be avoided at all costs, and all efforts by concerned monarchical powers were, as we have seen, to be directed towards the management of their own peoples. However, following 1848, interstate war is going to once again become common on the continent. The first was the Crimean War from 1853 to 1856, and this was essentially a product of failed Eastern question diplomacy. I haven't talked much about the Ottomans since our first lecture when I was setting up the political map for talking about the long 19th century and the buildup to the 20th century. But by the time we're talking about now, the middle of the 19th century, it was a foregone conclusion that the Ottomans were going to be driven from Europe at some point, and that the Porte, as it was known, might not even be able to survive, and certainly couldn't survive on its own. Reasons I'm actually going to touch on in our lecture towards war, as they are germane to the creation of the powder keg known as the Balkans. The British were particularly worried about the possible disintegration of the Ottoman Empire because, you see, the British, the real threat they perceived on the horizon wasn't a weak and economically backward Ottoman Empire, but rather it was the seemingly swelling colossus of Imperial Russia, which, apart from expanding its territorial reach south and increasingly looking like threatening the approach to India, the crown jewel of the British imperial system, it also looked increasingly as though it would take control of the Dardanelles, the critical strait that controls access between the Mediterranean and the Black Sea. There was also the matter of the significant Muslim population in India, whom the British feared, wrongly as it turned out, would be, ordered by the Sultan as the nominal head of the Islamic faith to wage a jihad or holy war against the British in India. But back to the Crimean War. The war, which was notoriously incompetently fought and which resulted in the deaths of almost 500,000 men, the overwhelming majority from disease and related unsanitary practices, resulted in the accomplishment of British and Allied war aims. That was, it prevented the Russians further encroaching on the Ottomans, at least temporarily. The Russians fought 4 actions against the Ottomans in the 19th century. All of them but the Crimean War, in which the British and French assisted the Ottomans, resulted in Russian victories. And the last of the 4 Russo-Turkish wars, that of 1877-78, will feature in the next lecture towards war, as these will see Russian power in the Balkans now coming right up next to Austria-Hungary, who will, at the conclusion of that war, take charge of administering Bosnia-Herzegovina. Cue ominous foreshadowing. Maybe most importantly, it is this loss to the combined Western powers that prompts reforms in Russia. More on that later. Okay, so while it was bloody, and the first conflict since the Napoleonic Wars to feature several of the major powers facing off against one another, if you look at the map, you'll see that the action was taking place at the very periphery of the European political scene. Again, consult Blackboard for these slides. Much more important, I would argue, were the wars of Italian independence and German unification, which are going to feature a series of conflicts between the Prussians, the French, the Austrians, the Italians, especially the kingdom of Piedmont-Sardinia, the most military and politically powerful of the Italian kingdoms. Before launching into what I think are some of the most fascinating conflicts you'll encounter, really the very self-conscious formation of modern nations and states in Germany and Italy, I just want to run you through the next 30-odd years of French political happenings as they relate not only to the wars of Italian independence and German unification, but also so that when we meet next, and I do the build-up to World War I, you'll understand where the French Third Republic came from and why it was such a chaotic mess. Okay, so in France in 1848, the king of the French, Louis Philippe, whom you'll remember was placed on the throne following the Revolution of 1830, is driven out, and there will be no new monarch this time. And the dreaded Republic, the Second French Republic, is declared. And while they did, of course, object, this time the Austrians and the other concerned powers were far too busy domestically to do much of anything about it, dealing with their own revolutions, as we saw last week. However, also like we saw last week, even in France, this apparently successful revolution stopped far short of overthrowing the social order. And the radical elements, the socialists, poor workers, and students, for example, will be crushed in the June days, when realizing the revolution was not going to result in the radical transformation of French society, but rather simply in the basic political revolution we spoke about in the context of the original French Revolution, an ill-considered revolt, possibly purposely revoked. It's unclear. It's bloodily suppressed, though, by the new government under the General Cavaignac. That is very clear. And in the subsequent election, the first by universal manhood suffrage on the continent, Louis Napoleon, nephew of the, by this time, deceased emperor, is overwhelmingly elected. Louis Napoleon, what to say about the little Napoleon, as he was derisively called? Well, on the one hand, we needn't be too cruel to him, as Victor Hugo and Karl Marx both made relentless fun of him during his own lifetime. He was the butt of every joke. And really, he was about as unexceptional an heir to the Napoleonic legacy imaginable. But he was, despite whisperings regarding his paternity, the heir to the Bonapartist movement in France, and so was de facto the heir to a political movement representative of French national greatness, rather than the lethargy and complacency of the restored monarchy, particularly during those final years under the particularly reactionary minister Francois Guizot. Like his uncle, Louis Napoleon believed in reform from above, and despite his claims to the contrary, he also believed in a powerful and aggressive France geopolitically. Fearing a social revolution, the liberals and conservatives both embrace him, forming a kind of party of order. And he calls in the army, and they wipe out the left for a generation. Within 2 years, he will launch a coup of his own. On the actual anniversary of his uncle crowning himself the first French emperor, no one mourns the Second Republic, and the Second French Empire will be with us all the way to the end of our lecture today. When it's destroyed in the final war of German unification, Louis Napoleon having been outfoxed by Cavour in Italy, and then fatally by Bismarck, and actually it was Cavaignac who crushes that leftist uprising. I misspoke. He defeats Cavaignac in the election. First, Italy. We haven't spent much time talking about the peninsula. Really, I introduced Italy in its politically fragmented state in our first lecture, touched on its reorganization by Napoleon and the awakening of an Italian national spirit during the years of French occupation, and then never said much more. So I suppose that's as good a place as any to pick up the story. The process of the creation of the modern Italian state during the 19th century, known as the Italian unification or Risorgimento, like the creation of a unified Germany, begins with Napoleon's invasion of the Italian peninsula in the late 18th century, when he created client republics, breaking up the traditional territories and disrupting the complex networks of local power brokers that had previously governed these regions going back centuries. After Napoleon's defeat, the Congress of Vienna aimed to restore the balance of power that in Europe, and Italy was fragmented into several states, each under the influence of different European powers, but primarily the Austrians are going to be the predominant power. Nationalism has also been brought to life among the Italians, and quickly secret societies like Young Italy, led by Giuseppe Mazzini, and the Carbonari, a revolutionary society that actually once counted young Louis Napoleon among its number, sought to promote Italian nationalism and independence, advocating for the creation of a unified Italian state, by violence if necessary, and there would be violence. Even before the defeat of Napoleon, it had taken multiple brutal campaigns to suppress revolts in places like Calabria and southern Italy. And in 1820, there was a major revolt, again in the south of the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies, based in Naples. Then a decade later in the north, you had major revolts in Modena and Parma. And then in 1848, of course, the Italians would play a significant part there as well, the failed First War of Italian independence being waged against the Austrians, who after the Congress of Vienna, as I said, had supplanted France as really the primary foreign power in play on the peninsula. And something I'd like to draw your attention to here is the coincidence of revolutionary activity across the continent. For example, at the same time of the revolt near Naples, you had the revolution in Greece kicking off just across the Ionian Sea. Then in the case of the revolts of Parma and Modena, these coincided with the July Revolution we talked about last time in 1830, the one that brought down the reactionary Bourbon King Charles X. And in 1848, well, we spent plenty of time talking about that already last week. So essentially, Italian nationalism needed repeated suppressing, and following the defeat of Napoleon by the much weaker Austrians. The Second Italian War of Independence will go much better than the first, because Count Camillo Cavour essentially takes to combining popular revolutionary aspects with traditional diplomacy and alliances to achieve the goal of a unified Italy. Also an army's help. Cavour represented the Kingdom of Piedmont-Sardinia, there in the northwest of the peninsula. He formed an alliance with France, led by the sympathetic Napoleon III, who attacks Austria during the Second War of Italian Independence, and that was 1859 to 1860, in conjunction with Piedmont. The Kingdom of Italy is proclaimed in 1861 with the King of Piedmont, Vittorio Emanuele II, as king. But it really isn't until 1870, in the incorporation of Rome, that the entire peninsula is brought under control there. And that's going to happen. The Italians are going to take advantage of French immobilization during the Franco-Prussian War, which we're going to talk to in a minute here. Sorry to Garibaldi, who receives very short shrift in this telling, but in case you're interested, the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies down in Naples, the southern half of the peninsula below the Papal States, those were effectively brought in by Garibaldi and his forces. And actually, Cavour plays on fears of social revolution to get the other powers to sign off on him moving down and taking control of central Italy. So he's very, very clever in the way he manipulates that situation, particularly Napoleon III, Louis Napoleon. But this unification of Italy will not be nearly as transformative for the balance of power as the unification of Germany, which we'll get to in just a minute here. However, it is going to have an interesting cascade effect on how the story of Europe unfolds in the run for World War I. Specifically here, I'm talking about The loss of its northern Italian possessions, the Kingdom of Lombardy and Venetia, the Italian unified state, this is going to cripple Habsburg finances. These were the wealthiest parts of the empire. And combined with pressure by the Hungarians, the Austrians had virtually no choice, having already been effectively excluded from the new Germany by Prussia, to yield to Hungarian equality. So now it's going to be the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And this means giving more control to the Hungarians, who are going to pursue a highly unpopular policy of Magyarization. That is, rather than allowing for and even encouraging cultural autonomy within their domains as kind of a way of diffusing nationalist sentiment, as the Austrian Habsburgs were trying to do with the Slovenes, Bohemians, etc., the Hungarians are going to try and forcibly absorb everyone into the Hungarian nation, learn the language, adopt the customs and the culture. And this is going to cause a lot of friction with their Slavic population, who look across the border at the newly created Serbia, which is going to be created as the Ottomans are pushed out of the Balkans with the help of Russia. And this is, again, kind of ominous rumblings of World War I. And I see we're pressed for time, and I can't very well start the next lecture Wednesday towards war without having unified Germany. So here we go. The creation of a unified Germany, again, for the sake of convenience, let's start our story with Napoleon, who rolls into Central Europe and effectively helps blow up the Holy Roman Empire. That is the loosely knit collection of dozens, even hundreds of polities, everything from Prussia to Bohemia to tiny bishoprics and free cities. He sweeps all that up and combines these units into a handful of larger entities in what's called the Confederation of the Rhine. This is essentially all the Germanic states except for Prussia and Austria. And the idea here is pretty simple. Use the fear of Prussia and Austria these smaller German states have, fear that they'll be swallowed up, to tie them to France. When Napoleon is defeated and the Congress powers gather, Metternich puts together the German Confederation, which is essentially the Confederation of the Rhine plus Prussia and Austria, with Austria planted firmly in the driver's seat. This general process, mediatization is what it's called, the merging together of political authorities, is going to be joined by economic union, which we talked about last time on Wednesday, the Zollverein, the brainchild of the Prussians, who want to create essentially a tariff union to increase the flow of trade within and between the German states. Austria, remember, critically doesn't join. It wants to keep its domestic industry protected. And this is a major mistake, because if you look at the map of the Zollverein, it almost one-to-one matches the border of the eventual final unified German state. That state would be created by Bismarck, a Prussian noble who essentially realized the only way to preserve the old landed order of the Prussian nobility he loved was by moving it into the confines of a larger political entity. That is, by Prussia absorbing and dominating the rest of the German states, excluding Austria, its only realistic rival for leadership. He does so in a series of wars, the first against Denmark with the help of Austria to seize two key provinces, Schleswig and Holstein. The second war against Austria, provoked by Bismarck by purposely violating the previously agreed upon joint administration of Schleswig and Holstein and then their division, which results in a quick Prussian victory. And then finally, the third war, the big one against France. Realizing the predominantly Catholic southern German states are reluctant to embrace Prussia's advances, Bismarck gets them to sign a mutual defense treaty and then tricks Napoleon III into declaring war on him. Napoleon III having realized too late that he has just allowed for the creation of a very powerful, unacceptably powerful neighbor right on his border. And then I believe it's the Spanish throne becomes vacant and a Hohenzollern candidate comes up, and Bismarck uses this pretext to provoke him using a series of subterfuges, including the Ems telegram, but essentially using this fear of French domination under a new Napoleon allows Bismarck to essentially absorb these southern German states over the course of the war. Now, obviously, I had to skim over the top of things here, only having an hour, and the point here is really just to set the table for what comes after. But a few final notes about Germany are in order. First, for centuries, the European balance of power had been predicated on a divided Germany. And that's because Germany, the most populous, most industrialized, most economically powerful state in the continent, right away. Further, it has the only professional, politically independent general staff. And Germany is essentially built to fight wars. Everything from, how its railroad tracks are laid, for example, goes perfectly to and from the front with parallel lines. There's a reason that World Wars I and II feature German armies that are far and away the best. And really, just look at its strategic location. It's right smack in the middle of everything. There are no natural defensive borders. I mean, you have to be good at fighting wars. Everything else related to Germany and related geopolitics of Europe are going to wait until next time to be wrapped up in the lecture. I have now teased so much, it's going to be really difficult to live up to the hype, but there you have it, towards war. I'll leave you with a few last things. First, this great quote, which really gets to what our reading was about for this week, which several of our lectures have been about. That is the making of states and of nations. And this quote's a very famous one. And we have made Italy. Now we must make the Italians. It's this idea that you have all this particularism in these states, Lombards, Romans, and Neapolitans. You have to fuse them all together into one people, quote unquote, Italians. And apart from things like literature and public rituals, the two institutions that are going to be really good at homogenizing the populations of places like Italy, where the state is trying consciously to form one unified nation, are the public school and the army. Periods of mandatory service are going to follow after many graduate from primary school. And this is going to help foster loyalty and a sense of belonging for those whose old identity markers, things like village or religion, are being eroded by modernity. As Nietzsche, around this time, prophetically, if insanely predicts, God is dead, we have killed him. But the new gods, things like nationalism, are going to produce wars even more terrible than those of religion of old. Thanks so much, and I'll see you next time.